Let's move on to our main event today, and that is motors and our motor board. Let's talk a little bit about how those work. Let's head over to the bench real quick, and we'll talk about each of the individual components. So here's my Arduino and breadboard. It's kind of where I left it last time. It might be a little bit different, and you might have unplugged things from our previous project, which is totally fine. We're going to do some different wiring here in just a second. I'm going to slide this out of the way. Now this is our motor. Now we talked briefly about this on the introduction video, but this has a little DC motor hooked into it. There's a gearbox, and then this one actually has a spot for a wheel on either side. It just makes it a little bit easier depending on how you mount it. You don't have to worry about it. And obviously they both spin the same direction. So if you want to go forward or backward, sometimes you have to reverse that around. But anyway, we'll get to that a little bit later. Now these wires that are hanging on do not come with it. In fact, I went ahead and soldered all these on for you guys. It's a little bit difficult to do just because the pins are really, really small. And then I went ahead and put some heat shrink on them. Just be a little bit careful with these. Don't yank on them. Try not to bend them unnecessarily. I put some extra long leads on so that you've got plenty of room to kind of move them around. And plug them into the breadboard and to our motor board here in a little bit as well. Now I went ahead and put some crimps on the end of these, which will fit into the breadboard as well as the motor board when we get to that here in a minute. So now you're thinking, hey, it's a DC motor, we've got a DC supply, we can just hook this up. And you're correct. Let's just go ahead and, actually I've got it right here. So let me just plug one of these into the 5-volt rail, and I'm going to plug one of them, I'm sorry, that was ground, and I'm going to plug one into the 5-volt rail. Now, it doesn't really matter which direction because this motor will spin both directions depending on which way I plug it in. So if I plug it in this way, it's spinning one direction, as you can see. And then if I do flip these around and I put this now into the 5-volt rail and this into the ground, you probably can't tell, but it is moving the other direction. And if you want to do this quick test, you go right ahead. You can go ahead and just plug it in. Like I said, it doesn't matter which way, but it will spin one direction one way and the other direction the other way. So with that knowledge and with what we know about being able to turn a digital pin on and off like we were doing with the laser and the LED earlier, we should be able to just plug this into our digital pin and control that and turn it on. Well, let's go ahead and test that. But I'm going to tell you right now, don't follow the next step. And I'll explain why in a minute. So here's a quick diagram of the circuit that I'm going to show you. I did add an LED so that we can turn that LED on and off. I did move it around a little bit just to make a little bit more room. We've got the switch exactly like we have been using it, and I went ahead and put this DC motor down here. Now I hooked the DC motor up to ground, and then I hooked the other lead up to pin 11. And now the idea is I can just turn 5 volts on and off using my digital right for pin 11, and that will run current through our motor back to ground and create a complete circuit. So let's go ahead and wire this up and let's see what happens. So there we go. I've got everything wired up. I've got my Arduino, I've got my breadboard. Here's the switch. I've got it wired the same way we've been using it. I put my LED back in with my resistor down to ground. Here's my DC motor that we've been talking about. I've got that hooked, the white lead to ground and the red lead over to pin 11. Just like we had in the diagram. So now when I push this LED, or I'm sorry, when I push this button, I'm going to turn the LED on and I'm going to turn the motor on, and I'm going to just turn it on for a few seconds, and then I'm going to turn them both off again. So this will just be a pulse where I click it, and in theory, that motor should go ahead and turn. Let's take a quick look at that code, and then we'll go ahead and upload the code. So here's what we're going to do on the code. I'm just going to show you a snapshot of it. I'm not going to build it up for you. So we're going to say Arduino starts loop forever. If the digital pin 2 is high, we're going to read that. We're going to turn the LED on, which is on pin 12. We're going to turn that to high. We're going to set pin 11 to high. We're going to wait 1 second, and then we're going to turn them both off, and that's it. Genius. Very simple. Let's upload this code and see what happens. I've got it coded up here in PictoBlocks. I'm going to connect to my board, and I am going to upload that code right now. It's building, and it's done. Here it is. Let's go ahead and push that button, and we'll see if this motor turns on. Remember, that LED should turn on. Perfect. Kind of. So the LED turns on for 1 second, and our motor doesn't do anything. Now, you might think, well, you've got that wired up wrong, and I can assure you I do have it wired up correctly. So why doesn't this motor turn on when I just power it directly from pin 11. Now we know if I plug this directly into 5 volts, it will go ahead and turn on. But now that I'm trying to control that via pin 11 with my switch, and we know it's working because we've got the LED turned on, the motor doesn't work. Well, if you have any ideas, think about that for a second and then return back to the video and I'll explain. Well, that didn't work so well. Did you figure out why? And don't worry if you couldn't figure it out. It's something that even when I got started, I was a little confused by it, and I just shook my head and I'm like, why didn't this work? If I put 5 volts out on my pin, it should spin. Well, the actual answer is it's got to do with the power. And the Arduino itself can put out something called 40 milliamps. Now the milliamps is the current, and current is equal to voltage times, or I'm sorry, power is equal to voltage times current. So this is the current value, 40 milliamps. Now that probably doesn't mean anything to a lot of you, which is completely fine. We're not going to dive that deep into it. But what is important is the number 40, which is a relatively small number. Now an LED will light at around 15 to 20 volts. So when we plugged in a whole bunch of LEDs, we could just say digital pin high, and they turned on without any problems. I mean, you guys have seen that. We had no issues running that. In fact, 48 milliamps is too high, and that's why we put those resistors in the first place. But it turns out this DC motor, and this is going to be true for virtually every single DC motor, actually takes a lot of power. Now, I checked this one that we're using, and this one takes between 200 milliamps and a maximum of 500 milliamps. Now, to put that in perspective, the entire Arduino itself is only going to be using a couple hundred milliamps, maybe 200 maximum, no matter what we're doing. But this motor requires at least that to just turn on. Now it did turn on when we plugged it into the 5 volts and ground. And the reason for that is that I had it plugged into my computer, and my computer can provide, it will provide about 1 amp or 1000 milliamps to that Arduino. So we had plenty of room. In fact, we could have plugged in probably 4 motors and it would still work. Now it's a little bit rough on the Arduino when we do that, but for what we're doing for small little bursts of power, it's not a big deal. Now we're going to need to know this a little bit later when we build our vehicle, because we're not going to power it from a computer. In fact, why would we? We wouldn't be able to drive it around the room if we had to have it tethered via USB. And we're not going to use those little white power banks that I provided. And the reason for that is that those power banks max out at 1 amp or 1000 milliamps, and they'll actually shut off. So if we turn 2 motors at the same time, which we're going to do, then the motor itself will trigger the overcurrent on the battery pack, and the battery pack will go dead, which sucks. But what we're going to do is we're going to use that little battery holder and use some AA batteries, which won't have that same problem. So now you can start to see that something that seemed pretty simple, like I'm going to plug my 5-volt motor into my Arduino and just run it, didn't work. And that's the reason behind that.